Chapter 11. Madeline bolted the door and flew into the kitchen, and she told the scared servants to shut themselves in. Then she ran to her own room. It was only a matter of moments for her to close and bar the heavy shutters. Yet, even as she was fastening the last one in the room she used as an office, a clattering of roaring hooves seemed to swell up in front of the house. She caught a glimpse of wild, shaggy horses and ragged, dusty men. She had never seen any vaqueros that required these horsemen. The vaqueros typically had grace and style, and they were fond of lace and glitter and fringe. They dressed their horses in silver trappings as well. But the riders now trampled into the driveway. They were uncouth and lean and savage. They were guerrillas, a band of raiders who'd been harassing the border since the beginning of the Revolution. A second glimpse assured Madeline that they were not all Mexicans. The presence of the outlaws in that band brought home to Madeline her real danger. She remembered what Stillwell had told her about recent outlaw raids along the Rio Grande. These flying bands, operating under the excitement of the Revolution, appeared here and there, everywhere, in a remote place, and were gone as quickly as they came. Mostly they wanted money and arms, but they would steal anything, and unprotected women had suffered at their hands. Madeline hurriedly collected her securities and the considerable money she had in her desk and ran out, closed and locked the door. Crossing to the patio on the opposite side of the house, and entered again, and went down a long corridor, trying to decide which of the many unused rooms would be the best to hide in. And before she made up her mind, she came to the last room. And just then, a battering of windows or doors in the direction of the kitchen, and shrill screams from the servant women increased Madeline's alarm. She entered the last room. There was no lock or bar upon the door, but the room was large and dark, and it was half full of bales of alfalfa hay. Probably it was the safest place in the house. At least time would be necessary to find anyone hidden there. She dropped her valuables into a dark corner and covered them with loose hay. That done, she felt her way down a narrow aisle between the piled-up bales and presently crouched in a niche. With the necessity of action over for the immediate present, Madeline became conscious that she was quivering and almost breathless. Her skin felt tight and cold, and there was a weight on her chest. Her mouth was dry, and she had a strange tendency to swallow. Her listening faculties seemed almost acute. Dull sounds came from parts of the house remote from her. In the intervals of silence between those sounds, she heard the squeaking and rustling of the mice in the hay. A mouse ran over her hand. She waited, listened, hoping yet dreaded to hear the clattering approach of her cowboys. There would be fighting, blood, and men injured and perhaps killed. Even the thought of violence of any kind hurt her, but perhaps the guerrillas would run in time to avoid clash with her men. She hoped for that, and prayed for it. Through her mind fitted what she knew of Nels or Monty or Nick Steele. She experienced a sensation that left her somewhat chilled and sick. Then she thought of the dark brown, fire-eyed Stewart. She felt a thrill drive away the cold nausea, and her excitement augmented. Waiting, listening, increasing all her emotions. Nothing appeared to be happening. Yet hours seemed to pass while she crouched there. Had Florence been overtaken? Could any of those lean horses outrun Majesty? She doubted it. She knew it could not be true. Nevertheless, the strain of uncertainty was torturing. Suddenly, the bang of the corridor door pierced through her and through all the dread of uncertainty. Some of the guerrillas had entered the east wing of the house. She heard a babble of jabbering voices, the shuffling of boots and clinking of spurs, and the slamming of doors and ransacking of rooms. Madeline lost faith in her hiding place. Moreover, she found it impossible to take the chance. The idea of being caught in that dark room by those ruffians filled her with terror. She must get out into the light. Swiftly she rose and went to the window. It was rather more of a door than a window, being a large aperture closed by two wooden doors on hinges. The iron hook wielded readily to her grasp, and one door stuck fast while the other opened a few inches. She looked out upon the green slope covered with flowers and bunches of sage and bush. Neither man nor horse showed in the narrow field of her vision. She believed she'd be safer hidden out there in the shrubbery than the house. The jump from the window would be easy for her, and with her quick decision came a rush and a stir of spirit that warded off her weakness. She pulled at the door. It did not budge. It was caught at the bottom. Pulling with all of her might proved to be in vain. Pausing with palms hot and bruised, she heard a louder, closer approach of the invaders in her home. Fear, wrath, and impotence contested with supremacy over her, and drove her to desperation. She was here alone, and she must rely on herself. And as she strained every muscle to move that obstinate door, and heard the quick, harsh voices of men and the sounds of hurried search, she felt sure that they were hunting for her. She knew it. She did not wonder at it, but she wondered if she were really Madeline Hammond, and if it were possible that brutal men would harm her. Then the tramping of heavy feet on the floor of the adjoining room lent her the last strength of fear. Pushing with hands and shoulders, she moved the door far enough open to permit the passage of her body. Then she stepped up on the sill and slipped through the hole. She saw no one. Lightly she jumped down and ran into the bushes, but these did not afford her the cover she needed. She stole from one clump to another, finding too late that she had chosen with poor judgment. The position of the bushes had drawn her closer to the front of the house rather than away from it, and just before her were horses, and beyond a group of excited men. With her heart in her throat, Madeline crouched down. A shrill yell, followed by running and mounting guerrillas, roused her hope. They had sighted the cowboys and were in flight. Rapid thumping of boots on the porch told of men hurrying from the house. Several horses dashed past her, not 10 feet distant. One rider saw her, for he turned to shout back, and this drove Madeline into panic. Hardly knowing what she did, she began to run away from the house, her feet seeming to leaden. She felt the same horrid powerlessness that had sometimes come over her when she dreamed of being pursued. Horses with shouting riders streaked past her in the shrubbery, and there was a thunder of hoofs behind her. She turned aside, but the thundering grew nearer. She was being run down. As Madeline shut her eyes and, staggering, was about to fall, apparently right into the pounding of hooves, a rude, powerful hand clasped round her waist, and, clutching deep and strong, swung her aloft. She felt a heavy blow from the shoulder of the horse as it struck her, and then a wrenching of her right arm as she was dragged up. A sudden blightening of pain made sight and feeling fade from her, but she did not become unconscious to the extent that she lost the sense of being rapidly borne away. She seemed to hold that for a long time. When her faculties began to return, the motion of the horse was no longer violent. For a few moments she could not determine her position. Apparently she was upside down. Then she saw that she was facing the ground, and must be across a saddle with her head hanging down. She could not move a hand. She could not tell where her hands were. And then she felt the touch of soft leather. She saw a high-topped Mexican boot wearing a big silver spur, and the raking flank and the legs of a horse, and a dusty, narrow trail. Soon a kind of red darkness veiled her eyes, and her head swam, and she felt motion and pain only dully. After what seemed 1,000 weary hours, someone lifted her from the horse and laid her upon the ground, where gradually, as the blood left her head and she could see, she began to get the right relation of things. She lay in a sparse grove of firs, and the shadows told of late afternoon. She smelled wood smoke, and she heard the sharp crunch of horses as they nipped at the grass. Voices caused her to turn her face. A group of men stood and sat around a campfire, eating like wolves. The looks of her captors made Madeline close her eyes, and the fascination, the fear they roused in her made her open them up again. Mostly they were thin-bodied, thin-bearded Mexicans, black and haggard and starved. Whatever they might be, they surely were hunger-stricken, and not one had a coat. A few had scarves, some wore belts in which were scattered cartridges. Only a few had guns, and these were of diverse patterns. Madeline could see no packs, no blankets, only a few cooking utensils, all battered and blackened. Her eyes fastened upon men she believed were white men, but it was from their features and not their color that she judged it. Once she had seen a band of nomad riders in the Sahara, and somehow was reminded of them by this motley outlaw troop. They divided their attention between the satisfying of ravenous appetites and vigilant watching down the forest aisles. They expected someone, Madeline thought, and manifestly, if it were a pursuing posse, they did not show anxiety. She could not understand more than a word here and there that they uttered. Presently, however, the name of Don Carlos revived keen curiosity in her, and realization of her situation, and then once more dread possessed her breast. A low exclamation and a sweep of an arm from one of the guerrillas caused the whole band to wheel and concentrate their attention in the opposite direction. They heard something. They saw someone. Grimly, hands sought for weapons, and then every man stiffened. Madeline saw what hunted men look like at that moment of discovery, and the sight was terrible. She closed her eyes, sick with what she saw, fearful of the moment when the guns would leap out. There were muttered curses, a short period of silence followed by whispering, and then a clear voice that rang out, "El Capitan!" A strong shock vibrated through Madeline, and her eyelids swept open. Instantly, she associated the name El Capitan with Stewart, and experienced a sensation of strange regret. It was not pursuit or rescue she thought of then, but death. These men would kill Stewart, but surely he had not come alone. The lean, dark faces, corded and rigid, told her what directions to look. She heard the slow, heavy thump of hoofs. Soon, into the wide aisle between the trees, moved the form of a man, arms flung high over his head. Then Madeline saw the horse, and she recognized Majesty, and she knew it really was Stewart who rode the roan. When doubt was no longer possible, she felt a suffocating sense of gladness and fear and wonder. Many of the guerrillas leapt up with drawn arms. Still Stewart approached with his hands high, and he rode right into the campfire circle. Then a guerrilla, evidently the chief, waved down the threatening men and walked up to Stewart. He greeted him. There was amaze, and pleasure, and respect in the greeting. Madeline could tell that, though she did not know what it was said. At the moment, Stewart appeared to her as cool and careless as if he were dismounting at her porch steps. But when he got down, she saw that his face was white. He shook hands with the guerrilla, and then with his glittering eyes they rode over the men and round the glade until they rested upon Madeline. Without moving from his tracks, he seemed to leap, as if a powerful current had struck him. Madeline tried to smile to reassure him that she was alive and well, but with the intent in his eyes, the power of his controlled spirit, telling her of her peril, and his froze the smile on her lips. With that, he faced the chief and spoke rapidly in the Mexican jargon Madeline always found so difficult to translate. The chief answered and spread wide his hands, one of which indicated Madeline as she lay there. Stewart drew the fellow a little aside and said something into his ear alone. The chief's hands swept up in a gesture of surprise. Again, Stewart spoke swiftly. The leader then turned to address the band. Madeline caught the words Don Carlos and pesos. There was a brief muttering protest, which the chief thundered down. Madeline guessed her release had been given by this guerrilla and bought from the others of the band. Stewart strode to her side, leading the roan. Majesty reared and snorted when he saw his mistress prostrate. Stewart knelt, still holding the bridle. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think so," she replied, essaying a laugh that was rather a failure. "My feet are tied." Dark blood blotted out all the white from his face, and lightning shot from his eyes. She felt his hands like steel tongs loosening the bonds around her ankles, and without a word, he lifted her upright and then upon Majesty. Madeline reeled a little in the saddle, held hard to the pommel with one hand, and tried to lean upon Stewart's shoulder with the other. "Don't give up," he said. She saw him gaze into the forest on all sides, and it surprised her to see the girl was riding away. Putting the two facts together, Madeline formed an idea that neither Stewart nor the others desired to meet with someone evidently due shortly at the glade. Stewart guided the roan off to the right and walked beside Madeline, steadying her in the saddle. At first, Madeline was so dizzy and weak that she could scarcely retain her seat. The dizziness left her presently, and then she made an effort to ride without help. Her weakness, however, and a pain in her wrenched arm made the task laborsome. Stewart struck off the trail, if there was one, and began keeping to the denser parts of the forest. The sun sank low, and the shafts of gold fell with a long slant among the firs. Majesty's hoofs made no sound upon the soft ground, and Stewart stalked on without speaking. Neither his hurry nor vigilance relaxed until at least 2 miles had been covered. Then he held to a straighter course, and did not send so many glances into the darkened woods. The level of the forest began to cut by little hollows, all of which sloped and widened, and presently the soft ground gave place to hard, bare soil. The horse snorted and tossed his head. A sound of splashing water broke the silence. The hollow opened into a wider one, through which a little brook murmured into a little over the stones. Majesty snorted again and stopped and bent his head. "He wants a drink," said Madeline. "I'm thirsty too, and very tired." Stewart lifted her out of the saddle, and as their hands parted, she felt something moist and warm. Blood was running down her arm and into the palm of her hand. I'm bleeding," she said a little unsteadily. "Oh, I remember, my arm was hurt." She held it out, and the blood making her conscious of her weakness. Stewart's fingers felt so firm and sure. Swiftly he ripped the wet sleeve. Her forearm had been cut and a little scratched. He washed off the blood. "Why, Stewart, it's nothing. I was only a little nervous. I guess that's the first time I ever saw my own blood." He made no reply as he tore her handkerchief into strips and bound her arm. His swift motions and his silence gave her a hint of how he might meet a more serious emergency. She felt safe, and because of that impression, When he lifted his head and she saw that he was pale and shaking, she was surprised. He stood before her, folding his scarf, which was still wet, and from which he made no effort to remove the red stains. "Miss Hammond," he said hoarsely, it was a man's hands, a greaser's fingernails that cut your arm. I knew who he was. I could have killed him, but I mightn't have got your freedom. Do you understand? I didn't dare." Madeline gazed upon Stewart, astonished more by his speech than his excessive emotions. "My dear boy," she exclaimed, and then she paused. She could not find the words. He was making an apology to her for not killing a man who had laid a rough hand upon her person. He was ashamed, and seemed to be in torture that she could not understand why he had not killed that man. There seemed to be something of a scorned passion in him that he had not been able to avenge her as well as free her. "Stewart, I understand. You are being my kind of a cowboy. I thank you." But she did not understand so much as she implied. She had heard many stories of this man's cool indifference to peril and death. He had always seemed as hard as granite. Why should the sight of a little blood upon her arm pale his cheek and shake his hand and thicken his voice? What was there in his nature to make him implore her to see the only reason that he could not kill an outlaw? The answer to that first question was that he loved her. It was beyond her to answer the second, but the secret of it lay in the same strength which his love sprang, an intensity of feeling which seemed characteristic of many Western men of simple, lonely, elemental lives. All at once, over Madeline rushed a tidal of realization of how greatly it was possible for such a man as Stewart to love her. The thought came to her in all of its singular power. All her Eastern lovers who had had the graces that made them her equal in the sight of the world were without the only great essential that a lonely, hard life had given to Stewart. Nature here struck a just balance. Something deep and dim in the future, an unknown voice called to Madeline and disturbed her. And because it was not the voice of her intelligence, she dreaded the ears of her warm and throbbing life and decided never to listen. "Is it safe to rest a little?" she asked. "I'm quite tired. Perhaps I'd be stronger if I was to get some rest." "We're all right now," he said. "The horse will be better, too. I ran him out, and uphill at that." "Where are we?" "Up in the mountains, 10 miles or more from the ranch. There's a trail just below here. I can get you home by midnight. They'll be worried down there for you." "What happened?" "Nothing much to anyone but you. That's the hard luck of it. Florence caught up with us on the slope. We were returning from the fire, and we were dead beat, but we got to the ranch before any damage was done. We sure had trouble in finding a trace of you. Nick spotted prints of your heels under the window, and then we knew. I had to fight the boys. If they had come after you, we would have never gotten you without a fight. We didn't want that. Old Bill come out packing a dozen guns. He was crazy. Had to rope Monty. Honest, I tied him to the porch. Nels and Nick promised to stay and hold him till morning. That was the best I could do. I was sure lucky to come up with the band so soon. I had figured right. I knew that guerrilla chief. He was a bandit in Mexico. It's a business with him. But he fought for Mandro, and it was with him that was a good deal. He might be a greaser, but he's white." "How did you get my release?" "I offered them money. That's what the rebels all want. They need money. They're a lot of poor, hungry devils." "I gather you offered to pay a ransom. How much?" $2,000, Mex. I gave them my word. I'll have to take the money. I told them when and where I'd meet them.
Certainly. I'm glad I've got the money. Madeline laughed. What a strange thing to happen to me. I wonder what Dad would have to say. Stewart, I'm afraid he'd say $2,000 is more than I'm worth, but tell me, that rebel chieftain did not demand money?
No, the money it's for his men.
What did you say to him? I saw you whisper in his ear.
Stewart dropped his head, averting her direct gaze. We were comrades before Juarez. One day I dragged him out of a ditch, and I just reminded him. And then I told him something, I thought.
Stewart, I know from the way he looked at me that you said something about me.
Her companion did not offer a reply to this, and Madeline did not press the point.
I heard Don Carlos named several times. That interests me. What have Don Carlos and his vaqueros have to do with this?
That greaser has all to do with it, replied Stewart. He burned his ranch and corrals to keep from getting them, but he also did it to draw the boys away from your home. They had a deep plot, all right. I left orders with someone to stay with you, but Al and Stillwell, who were both hotheads, rode off this morning, and then the guerrillas come down.
Well, what was the plot, as you call it?
To get you, he said bluntly.
Me? Stewart, you do not mean my capture, whatever you call it, was anything more than a mere accident?
I mean that. But Stillwell and your brother think the guerrillas wanted money and arms, and they just happened to make off with you because you ran under a horse's nose.
You're not inclined to that point of view?
I'm not. Neither's Nell or Nick Steele. And we know Don Carlos and the greaser. Look how the vaqueros chased Flo for you.
What do you think, then?
I'd rather not say.
But, Stewart, I would like to know. If it was about me, surely I ought to know,
protested Madeline.
What reason have Nels and Nick to suspect Don Carlos of plotting to abduct me?
I suppose they've no reason you'd take. Once I heard Nels say he had seen the greaser look at you, and if he ever saw him do it again, he'd shoot him.
Why, Stewart, that's ridiculous. To shoot a man for looking at a woman. This is a civilized country.
Well, maybe it would be ridiculous in a civilized country. There's some things about civilization I don't care for.
What, for instance?
For one thing, I can't stand for the way men let other men treat women.
But, Stewart, that's strange talk from you, who that night when I came.
She broke off, sorry that she'd spoken. His shame was not pleasant to see. Suddenly he lifted his head, and she felt scorched by flaming eyes. Suppose I was drunk. Suppose I'd met some ordinary girl. Suppose I had really made her marry me. Do you not think I would have stopped being a drunkard and been good to her?
Stewart, I do not know what to think about you, replied Madeline.
Then followed a short silence. Madeline saw the last bright rays of the setting sun glide over a distant crag. Stewart rebridled the horse and looked at the saddle girths. I got off the trail. About Don Carlos, I'd say right out. Not what Nels and Nick think, but I know what I know. Don Carlos was hoping to make off with you for himself, the same as if you had been some poor slave girl down in Sonora. Maybe he's got a deeper plot than my rebel friend told me. Maybe he even went so far as to hope for the American troops to chase him. The rebels were trying to stir up the United States. They'd welcome intervention. But, however that may be, the greaser meant evil to you, and has meant it ever since he saw you first. That's all.
Stewart, you've done me and my family a service we can never hope to repay.
I've done the service, only don't mention pay to me. But there's one thing I'd like to know, and I'd find it hard to say. It's prompt, maybe, by what I've known you to think of me, and what I imagine your family and friends would think if they knew. It's not prompted by pride nor conceit. But it's this. Such a woman as you should never have come to this God-forsaken country unless she meant to forget herself. But, as you did come, and as you were dragged away by those devils, I want you to know that all your wealth and position and influence, all that power behind you, would never have saved you from hell tonight. Only a man, such as Nick Steele or Nels or I, could have done that. Madeline Hammond felt the great leveling force of the truth. Whatever the difference between her and Stewart, or whatever the imagined difference set up by false standards of class and culture, the truth was that here on this wild mountainside, she was only a woman, and he was simply a man. It was a man that she needed, and if her choice could have been considered in this extremity, it would have fallen upon him who had just faced her in a quiet, bitter speech. Here was food for thought. "I reckon we better start on now," he said, then drew the horse close to a large rock. "Come on." Madeline's will greatly exceeded her strength. For the first time she acknowledged to herself that she had been hurt. Still, she did not feel much pain except when she moved her shoulder. Once in the saddle, where Stewart lifted her, she drooped weakly. The way was rough. Each step the horse took hurt her, and the slope of the ground threw her forward on the pommel. Presently, as the slope grew rockier and her discomfort increased, she forgot everything except that she was suffering. "Here's the trail," said Stewart at length. Not far from that point Madeline swayed, and, but for Stewart's support, would have fallen from the saddle. She heard him swear under his breath. "Here, this won't do," he said. "Throw your leg over the pommel. The other one there." And then, mounting, he slipped behind her, and lifted and turned her, and then held her with his left arm so that she lay across the saddle and his knees, her head resting against his shoulder. As the horse started into a rapid walk, Madeline gradually lost all pain and discomfort when she relaxed her muscles. Presently she let herself go and lay inert, greatly to her benefit. For a little while she seemed to be half drunk with the gentle swaying of a hammock. Her mind became at once dreamy and active, as if thoughtful, recording the slow, soft impressions poured into her from all of her senses. A red glow faded in the west. She could see out over the foothills, and where twilight was settling grey upon the crests, dark into the hollows. Cedar and pinyon trees lined the trail, and there was no more firs. At intervals, huge, drab-colored rocks loomed over her. The sky was clear and steely. A faint star twinkled, and lastly, close to her, she saw Stewart's face, once more dark and impassive, with the eyes fixed upon the trail. His arm, like a band of iron, held her, yet it was flexible and yielded to the motion of the horse. One instant she felt the brawn, the bone, and heavy, powerful. The next, the stretch and the ripple, the elasticity of the muscles. He held her as easily as if she was a child. The roughness of his flannel shirt rubbed her cheek, and beneath that she felt the dampness of the scarf he had used to bathe her arm. Deeper still, the regular pound of his heart. Against her ear, filling it with the strong beat, his heart seemed a mighty engine deep within a great cavern. Her head had never before rested upon a man's chest, and she had no liking for it there. But she felt more than the physical contact. The position was mysterious and fascinating, and something natural in it made her think about life. Then, as the cool wind blew down from the heights, lengthening and loosening her tumbling hair, she was compelled to see strands of it curl softly into Stewart's face, before his eyes and across his lips. She was unable to reach it with her free hand, and therefore could not refasten it. And when she shut her eyes, she felt those loosening strands playing upon his cheeks. In the keener press of such sensations, she caught the smell of dust and a faint, wild, sweet tang in the air. There was a low, rustling sigh of wind in the brush alongside the trail. Suddenly the silence ripped apart in the sharp bark of a coyote, and then from far away came a long wail, and then Majesty's metal-rimmed hoof rang on stone. These latter things lent probability to that ride for Madeline. Otherwise it would have seemed like a dream. Even so, it was hard to believe. Again, she wondered if this woman who had begun to think and feel so much was Madeline Hammond. Nothing had ever happened to her, and here, playing about her like her hair played with Stewart's face, was an adventure. Perhaps death, surely life. She could not believe the evidence of the day's happening. Would all of her people, her friends, even believe it? Could she tell it? How impossible to think that a cunning Mexican might have used her to further the interests of a forlorn revolution. She remembered the ghoulish visages of those starved rebels, and marveled at her blessed fortune in escaping from them. She was safe, and now self-preservation had been some meaning for her. Stewart's arrival in the glade, the courage with which he had faced the outlawed men, grew as real to her now as the iron arm that clasped her. Had it been an instinct which was imparted to her to save this man who lay ill and hopeless in the shack of Chihuahua? In helping him, had she hedged around her forces that had just operated to save her life? Or, if not that, more than life had been to her. She believed so. Madeline opened her eyes after a while and found that the night was fallen. The sky was dark, a velvety blue blazing with white stars. The cool wind tugged at her hair, and through sharp, waving strands she saw Stewart's profile bold and sharp against the sky. And then, as her mind succumbed to her bodily fatigue, again her situation became unreal and wild. A heavy languor like a blanket began to steal upon her. She wavered and drifted, and with the last half-conscious sense of a muffled throb of her ear, something intangible sweet, deep-throned and strange like a distant calling bell, she fell asleep with her head upon Stewart's breast. End of chapter 11.